don't have enough education to be a thought leader. No one would pay me to coach them. I'm not a speaker. I have panic attacks every time I get in front of an audience. There's no way I could write a book. Do any of these sound familiar? These were the very thoughts that I had before I started the Thought Leader Academy. For years, I beat myself up every time I thought about stepping into the leader who I needed to be. Because every time that I was going to step into that leadership position, my brain would chime in with some really unhelpful advice. The reality was I had everything I needed. I just didn't know how to get it out into the world in a way that others would understand. These thoughts weren't really true. They weren't helpful, and they certainly weren't helping me build myself as a thought leader. What I was ignoring was the fact that I had unique experiences, a unique way of looking at the world. My unique voice was my leadership tool. It allowed others to see my ideas through a unique lens. Now, this is exactly what you can do. Your ideas are your leadership tools. And this all comes down to perspective. That's what I'm really talking about here. Perspective is one of those things that we don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about, but yet it's the thing that drives everything we do. What we're really talking about here is doing the inner work. Stepping into your authority as a thought leader is really about understanding first the perspective you have on who you are, what you know, and how you show up to convey those very things. So your leadership mindset is the thing that drives your success or lack thereof as a thought leader. Let's start off with how you perceive yourself. Take a moment and write down some words that would describe how you see yourself. Now, I'm going to challenge you a little bit because now I want you to write down some words about how you believe your audience perceives you, not how they actually perceive you, because truthfully, you don't know that. Now, I want you to compare the two lists. What do you see that's different? How you perceive yourself and how you perceive audience perceives you actually creates how the audience really perceives you. And when we have some differences in those two lists, what happens is our audience is perceiving our own inner turmoil. Our own inner critic starts to speak louder than the value that we're bringing. And so when we are showing up in that place of discordance, what happens is our audience doesn't actually connect with us. And in some cases, doesn't believe us. So aligning how we see ourselves and how we believe the audience sees us is really the biggest task we have in stepping into our thought leadership. So aligning how we see ourselves and how we perceive that the audience sees us is really step number one in you becoming a thought leader. Because choosing a helpful perspective is the first step. It is a triangle. How I perceive myself, how I perceive that others perceive me, equal how I actually am perceived. If you think of math, it's like any mathematical equation. A triangle, there's a truth to it. Define two sides, one side, two sides. The third side gets defined for you. And as I said, if there is a discordance or a difference in how I perceive myself and how others perceive me, that is picked up by the audience and they don't connect with you. So the first step is to choose how you want your audience to perceive you. Now, I'm not suggesting that you fake it till you make it. Believe me, that never works, because as soon as you get into the words of faking it, you're in fact choosing an unhelpful perspective. So what I am saying, however, is that find the places where you believe who you are. Find the areas where you feel most comfortable and show up in those places, in that information, from those places of confidence. By creating a confident perspective, what you're doing is helping the audience to connect more deeply with your content, with your ideas, and with your value. When we see people who are fully in their value, when they are fully in a confident perspective, we see it not only in how they're conveying information, but we see it in the set of their body. We see it in their shoulders, in their eye contact. We see it in their smile, and we hear it in the language they use and the stories they tell. How we convey our information is largely dependent on how we perceive ourselves. So when we're perceiving ourselves as having value, it shows in everything we do and everything we say. And the truth is, as a leader, it's your job to be a professional communicator. So learning how to convey that information through your words and through your actions is essential. What we're really talking about here is your mindset, the mindset that you take with you wherever you go. And if you are stepping into your thought leadership, that mindset is essential. Now, when I'm working with thought leaders, and I've worked with literally thousands of thought leaders, I can tell you that the way in which we look at how they show up is really through two very specific points. One is the way in which they emotionally connect with their audiences. And two is the confidence in the knowledge that they bring. Now, these two measures can be plotted on a chart. Imagine sort of a graph. On one side, we've got emotional connection, and on the bottom, we've got confidence in the knowledge that you bring. When you're thinking of it in this way, we start to see people sort of plot into various areas. Somebody who wants to step into their thought leadership but is having difficulty might live all the way over to the right on the confidence in your knowledge side and sort of lower down on the emotional connection side. Now, I would call these people experts. They're really confident in the knowledge that they have. In fact, that's where they like to stay, in the area of facts and data knowledge. And they convey information to us in a way that really speaks to the expertise that they have. It's important to them that we know all of those facts and data, and those are really important things. However, they don't like going into the softer side of emotional connection and influence. It feels like it might, in fact, denigrate the facts and data that they have. But because they don't go into that influence area, what happens is they start to disconnect from their audience. In fact, their audience has a hard time following them because the facts and data are difficult to understand and they're difficult to remember. They are not as effective. That perspective they have that we talked about earlier, how they saw themselves was as an expert, but how they perceived that others see them was that they needed to make sure that you saw them as an expert. So in fact, perhaps they believed that you needed convincing. And so they stuck in the facts and data. The mindset was, I need to show up as that expert and prove my expertise. I don't want to influence you with emotions. I want to prove my expertise. But in doing so, they disconnect from their audience and their audience gets lost in their data. Now, if we go to the other side of that graph, remember emotional connection and confidence in your knowledge. If we're over here on the emotional connection side and high up in this corner, in this quadrant, we call that the change makers. They're passionate about that emotional connection. They're passionate about being influential. They want you to help them make the change in the world that they want to make. They're passionate about their information. They're passionate about what they know, but maybe they lack confidence in what they know. In fact, perhaps they're afraid of going too deep into that knowledge. The confidence isn't so much in what they know, but in the fact that they don't know how to convey it in a way that doesn't lose you as their audience. So they stay on the influence side. They stay on the emotional connection side. They deeply connect with their audience, but they don't ground their knowledge in the facts and data that are necessary. And so what happens is their audience may really like them, but feel like something's missing, that their argument isn't complete, that their information is lacking in substance. And so their audience disconnects and feels as if they're ungrounded. So change makers and experts are kind of both fighting the same challenge, that they're not deeply connecting with their audience. But the reason that they're not deeply connecting is because their perception of themselves and their perception of how the audience sees them is out of alignment. The change maker's perception of how you see them is that they perceive that you expect them to come in with heavy arguments of facts and data. And so therefore, they go deeply into the influence and disconnect from you as the audience. And really, when in my experience in working with both change makers and experts, is that they're actually the same person. They both actually have lots of knowledge, grounded in education, grounded in experience, grounded in what they need to be that expert or change maker in the topic that they're conveying. But what's missing is their ability to expertly convey those data and facts in a way that connects with their audience. And so they're the same person. They're just flip-flopping between, do I go heavy into influence and let go of the facts, or do I go heavy into facts and let go of the influence? And it's not necessary to choose, because what a thought leader knows is that when you seamlessly blend your influence and your knowledge, that's what puts you into that upper right-hand quadrant of the thought leader. The thought leader is able to do that because what they're doing is they're blending their knowledge in such a way that we hear the facts and data, but we also hear the passion. And of course, the way you do that is through story. Storytelling is the essential piece that's missing when we're an expert or a change maker. Our storytelling needs to help us in building in the facts and the data with the influence and the passion that we bring to everything. Now, there is another quadrant that I haven't talked about that probably should be mentioned, and that's the, low on emotional connection and low in confidence and knowledge. We call this the connector. The connector is that person who passes along all the opportunities, who doesn't even get onto the stage or get up to the front of the room or answer the question. The connector is often the person who's deep in imposter syndrome. Now, that's a challenge for them, but also for us, because you see, regardless of whether you identify as an expert, a change maker, or a connector, the reality is your unique voice and your unique lens holds the key to us understanding the ideas that you're bringing out into the world. And when we're able to understand your ideas, we're able to see the world differently. We need you to be able to help us to understand what you know. That's what a thought leader does. You do it not because it's about the ego of being understood. You do it because what you're doing is contributing to a bigger future. You're contributing to creating a future that has ideas that go beyond those of the accepted thought leaders of today. The reality is, the thought leaders who we follow today don't look like me, quite frankly. And they often don't look like many of you. They tend to be a bit more homogeneous. They tend to have come from specific industries or specific backgrounds. If you have taken maybe a little bit of a different route to your thought leadership, maybe if you look a little different from the norm or sound a little different from the norm, or maybe like me, you've got blue hair and are neurodiverse, your thought leadership doesn't tend to be heard as often. And this is why it's really important that we all get out there and use our voice as thought leaders. It's important for the world to hear what we have to say, for our ideas to take root, because what we're doing by doing that is each of us is contributing to creating a vision of the future that is more sustainable and is inclusive of the voices and the needs of all of those who are living within that future. Your voice, my voice, and the voices of countless others who are needed. Because thought leadership isn't something that's outside of us. Thought leadership is something that each of us brings uniquely into the world. And so when we choose to seamlessly blend the emotional influence that we have with our audience, with our confidence in the knowledge that we have, we're able to convey that in a way that evokes change. And that's what we're really trying to do. So, understanding your unique perspective that you believe others are seeing in you and being in alignment with that helps you to convey it in a way that creates change. But so many of us actually approach everything we do from a place of a limiting belief. These are what get in the way of us actually taking our thought leadership out to the world. What do I mean by a limiting belief? A limiting belief is a thought or a judgment about yourself that in some way limits your ability to create impact. It restricts you from using your voice in an effective way. A limiting belief is what holds us in that place of connector. It's also what keeps us from using emotion as an expert or using facts as a change maker. If you look at those words that I had you write down a little while ago, you're going to see some limiting beliefs living inside of them. You'll see how you perceive yourself, and then you'll see how you perceive that others perceive you. And the difference starts to indicate the limiting belief in between those two places. So, what limiting beliefs are holding you back, and how do you surface them so that you can change them? The first thing we need to do is to surface those limiting beliefs. They can be held really deeply, and we need to go into ourselves and find them. The little exercise I had you do at the very beginning of writing down those words was the beginning of surfacing. Now, I want you to take a couple of moments and I want you to think about writing down some statements using the following prompts. I'm just I can't. No one would ever. I hate it when. Using each one of these prompts, I want you to finish the sentence with something that has been holding you back. I'm just a clerk. I can't possibly be a thought leader. I don't have the education. I'm just a researcher. I just research information. I'm not the thought leader. No one would ever trust me to build out a full campaign on how to change the world. I hate it when people try to sell me. And so therefore, I'm not going to try to sell anyone. These might be some of the things that come up for you. Those types of statements, inside of them live some limiting beliefs. Some of those were limiting beliefs that I've held for years. I was a researcher. That's exactly what I did when I worked in the agency world. I never really thought that me as a researcher meant that I could be something more in the world as a thought leader. I never really connected those two things, quite frankly. I was doing research, I was doing consumer research. We were discovering people's behaviors and why they make buying decisions. But I never really thought about it through the lens of how we impact others. Those limiting beliefs were holding me back. And as I stepped into my thought leadership, working with thought leaders, I had to review some of that. I had to see that my original thoughts had benefits, that they had value to the world, and that the way that I saw the world that was helpful for others. Because when I was able to surface my limiting beliefs and get through it and step onto a stage and start conveying information in a way that helped others, telling my story and the elements of my story, others saw themselves. That is how we start to convey our thought leadership. Step number one is to surface the limiting beliefs. Step number two, assess them. Are they true? Was it true that me as a researcher wasn't actually having any impact? No, it wasn't true at all. Of course, I was having impact. I just wasn't taking the time to really look at the impact that I was having. When I moved into speaker coaching with the work that I did, starting with TEDx Toronto and moving on to many other TEDx's, I always saw that I was helping the speakers to define what they wanted to say to the audience. I wasn't looking at it as my own thought leadership. But in retrospect now, I can see that the work I was doing with every speaker I've ever worked with was actually contributing to a greater whole. So my idea that I wasn't creating impact was flawed. So I had to surface that as a belief, that my belief was that I couldn't make impact, that I was only going to help others create impact. So surface that limiting belief. Secondly, assess it. Was it true? No, it wasn't true. I was, in fact, making impact. I was making impact with every speaker that I was working with. And in turn, the audiences that they were conveying their messages to. Next is where you want to acknowledge where you're making progress. Because you see, what happens often in this process is we can surface a limiting belief and then we can assess it, and then we make the mistake and go back into our process, and we get angry at ourselves and say, well, I'm never going to change that. Well, that's not helpful, right? Because the reality is change takes time. You're not going to get it right the first time, but eventually you will. So acknowledge where you're making progress. The fact that you may have got the thought wrong or not changed the habit, but you noticed that you didn't change that habit, that's progress. That's actually moving forward with the concept. Acknowledge yourself. Say, I didn't get it this time, but I remembered that I should. That's progress, not perfection. Let me take you through that again. Surface, assess, acknowledge, reframe, and repeat. So we surface the belief, we assess whether it's true, we acknowledge where we've made some progress, but we also want to reframe that belief. If we go back to my limiting belief of not being able to make impact, I needed to reframe it. So I had to reframe it and say, I make impact every time I coach a speaker. When that limiting belief came up and said, well, you can't make impact, you're not the one on stage, I had to reframe it and say, I was already making impact by helping others to be on stage. Surface the limiting belief, assess whether it's true, acknowledge where you're already doing the thing that your limiting belief is telling you you can't. Reframe that belief so that you've got something new to believe, and then do it again. So when we are reframing our limiting beliefs, it takes time. You've got to do it over and over again. These are beliefs that are very worn into our brain. They're pathways inside the brain that are like well-trodden paths. And so, you've got to create a new path. And the limiting belief is going to come up. And you need to, again, remember that you've got a new belief. So for me, I had to surface that making impact was something that I didn't believe I could do. I had to ask myself, was that true? And I had to see that, in fact, and acknowledge that I was already creating impact with the people who I was coaching. So even though I may not have been on stage, so when my limiting belief was coming up about being in front of an audience, all I had to do was go back to that new belief that said, I create impact every time I coach a speaker. This was powerful for me. It was powerful because I was having panic attacks in front of audiences. I'd had some really bad experiences when I worked in the agency world that caused me to go into a panic attack in front of a live audience. And I had to reframe a belief that allowed me to get back up in front of an audience, because this is what I do for a living. And so I had to find it. And it took me a while. I didn't go from having a limiting belief that was causing me to have a panic attack to being in front of an audience overnight. It took me time. It took practice. It took belief, but I was able to get there. And when I did, my whole world changed. I started stepping up in front of audiences and speaking my truth, finding my voice, creating impact with my knowledge. And that's what I want for you. I want you to be able to have that same confidence in the knowledge you have and influences with the audience you speak to. And all of that comes back to simply understanding how you perceive yourself and how you perceive that others perceive you. Because by doing that, you'll find the places where those limiting beliefs are hanging out and sabotaging the thought leader who you can become. I want to make sure that this is something that gets ingrained in you, and that you've got the opportunity to be able to practice this powerful exercise. So to do that, I've created a little worksheet with all the things that we just went through in this video, so that you can find the limiting beliefs that are holding you back. You can assess them, you can acknowledge them, and you can reframe them. And you can do this on a regular basis so that you step into the thought leader of who you are. I've linked the download in the description below. Go ahead and click on it now and get your limiting beliefs worksheet so that you can step into the thought leader who you are so that you can start using your voice and creating the impact that you want to make. I can't wait to hear your thought leadership as you step into the thought leader who you are. Now, go ahead and subscribe to this channel and make sure you check back here often so that you can get more videos that are helping you build your confidence, build your influence, and be valued as the thought leader you are.